So I'm listening to this video from, what is that? The New York Times podcast. And essentially it's talking about ADHD, which is like something I've thought about for a vast majority of my life because my brother had ADHD, and he was diagnosed before potentially I was even born, or at the very least it was a very young age. The gap between our ages was he was 6 when I was born, so a 6-year gap. And so anyways, because I had known that he was diagnosed with ADHD, there was always like a partial interest in ADHD, as far as like, what it is, why did people get diagnosed with it. And so when I was going to school and I wanted to get into psychology, or I wanted to learn about the brain and why people do things that they do and so on and so forth, I learned, I feel like, fairly quickly through taking some of the classes that I was taking that essentially there's a book called the DSM-5. I don't know if it's been updated since I was essentially taking psychology classes, probably like 8 years ago or whatever the case may be now, a long time ago now. And the DSM-5, which I can't remember what the acronym stands for at the moment, is essentially just, I would say, the booklet or the manual for people who would be going into psychology of all of the essentially different terms and diagnoses that you could place on a patient. So in this case, ADHD could potentially be one of those diagnoses that you'd find in the DSM-5. But anyway, so part of my learning was they discussed how just in like the field of psychology is like an ever-evolving field, hasn't been around for a very long time. Because it hasn't been around for a very long time, that means it's like kind of updating at a fairly rapid pace. And so that means things that would be diagnoses in the DSM would essentially fall out of the book as they got replaced with other diagnoses or other terms or whatever the case may be, which means that I wouldn't say that it stayed incredibly consistent or inconsistent. I'm not a professional, I don't know. But just based on that alone and that description of me when I was initially learning in school, that was a little concerning to me, because essentially if you are diagnosing people with something and then 20 years later that's not even a diagnosis anymore, and then you kind of look at that and you go, well, so how much of this is just subjective belief as far as like why someone is getting diagnosed, or is it actually true that this person has a mental health disorder or whatever the case may be? And so essentially this New York Times video that I'm not even halfway through is talking about exactly that with ADHD, which is essentially there's a guy he's doing research, and in doing that research, because he was diagnosed at a very young age, essentially trying to figure out, is this even a real thing from the sounds of it? Again, I haven't finished this, but that's what it sounds like to me. He has a personal connection to it. I have a somewhat personal connection to it, because like when I think of my brother and him having been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, I just think that like, in I would say the 90s and the early 2000s, and I don't know this for a fact, this is admittedly like just my own personal belief, my understanding is that there was a lot of diagnoses of ADD and ADHD as that came out as something that you could diagnose kids with. And so because of that, you saw essentially a rocket of diagnoses as far as a lot more people were suddenly getting diagnosed with this thing that wasn't previously available to them. And because of that, it's essentially started giving a lot of kids this anxiety of, oh, here's this thing, this explains why they're super hyperactive, this explains why, maybe they're having trouble in school, this explains a lot of stuff. And, would I say that my brother fell into that kind of group? I'd say, yeah, he had trouble in school. I'd say he had a lot of energy. I wouldn't necessarily say that there was anything wrong with him, though. He's very popular, and a lot of people liked him. He's very charismatic. And maybe that is ADHD. Maybe it is ADD. I don't know. But essentially, from the sounds of it, even just listening to this, 20 years later, 25 years later, there still doesn't seem to be a consistent like professional take on whether or not there is like a legitimate diagnosis for ADD or ADHD, as in that it might be more subjective to who's doing the diagnoses. And I'm not sitting here as someone who's trying to be a skeptic of psychology. I'm someone who appreciates psychology, and I like psychology, and I like what it can do as far as being able to give us things and terms that we can essentially apply to ourselves whenever we're making bad decisions and we don't know why. That can be reassuring in the same way that it can be discouraging. But I would say for most of my life, though, hearing that and knowing that, especially since I went to school, it has made me somewhat skeptical about how the field of psychology is doing things as far as like coming up with diagnoses and making sure that they're legit before actually starting to diagnose people with those disorders or mental health, whatever the case may be. And this to me feels like one of those things where even now, my mother's a teacher, and in the same way that she's been a teacher for about more than 16 years, maybe 20-ish at this point. And whenever she was first getting into teaching, it was very much so one of those things. A lot of kids are being diagnosed with ADD, ADHD. And she knew that, having obviously been these children's teacher. And by virtue of that, I kind of knew like, oh, okay, there's a lot of kids that are coming through these schools just in pre-K that already have ADHD or ADD diagnoses. And then now for me, in the same sort of way my mom's telling me, autism and autism diagnoses seem to be happening more frequently. There's a lot more kids that are, determined to be autistic or getting diagnosed with autism, and I would say again an ever increasing younger age. And again, I'm not saying all this as somebody who is trying to be skeptical of professional field of research. It's more so trying to just kind of beg the question of any field of research. Doesn't matter if it's psychology, doesn't matter if it doesn't matter. If I think there's an ethical standpoint of making sure that all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed before you really put something out into the world, especially when it comes to how people are going to perceive themselves. And so even now, to be watching this and be hearing this discussion unfold, which again I haven't even finished, maybe they do get further in the discussion. I should have just stopped and listened to the rest of it. But my personal take on it is that I think we should be more cognizant of what we're doing when we're doing it and not rush to conclusions in any field of research. If you're researching something that has the potential to damage people, has the potential to harm people, maybe we should reconsider what we're doing. Maybe we shouldn't be going out of our way to continue that research or continue going down that road, as opposed to reconsidering maybe we should put this towards more, ethical ventures at the end of the day. And I'm not saying that in the case of this situation with psychology that would, that's not necessarily what I'm saying here, but what I am saying in this specific case is that maybe we just should have waited before we started diagnosing people with something before we really knew for a fact what it was. Because even here they're saying the researchers are trying to find a biomarker, which essentially would be like a form of DNA or something else within the body that is essentially conclusive that this person has ADD or ADHD. And they're having difficulty finding that, and that to me just goes to show that even after all of this time, there is still an inconsistency as far as knowing when someone does or does not have ADD or ADHD. And so I think that is inconsiderate to the people that ultimately may have or may not have been diagnosed, because then it does seem like it is ultimately very subjective, and it shouldn't be if it's a science.